I'm standing in for Dr. Cole Burton, my colleague at Innovates and soon starting as professor at the University of British Columbia. Cole is leading this project. He couldn't be here today because he's got some other commitments. The project is an examination of the response of wildlife to seismic line restoration in the Algar habitat restoration program. And this is a research project that is funded by COSIA JIP, led by Nexon, and also some funding by PTAC, Innovates, and then the two universities, Victoria and British Columbia. So I'd like to acknowledge especially PTAC and especially COSIA and Nexon and the partners there on pushing this through. So the motivation behind this is obviously the caribou problem that all of us are very familiar with. As oil and gas and other sectors venture into caribou habitat, the overlap between anthropogenic features and that caribou habitat increases. And concomitant with that overlap through time has been the decline in caribou populations that we've seen. So this is the famous graph from Herview's latest paper showing decline in population change through time. One of the putative mechanisms by which caribou are declining is the introduction of seismic lines. So as you get seismic lines in the landscape, wolves are using them to move farther and faster, as illustrated by Melanie Dickey's research, which is increasing predation efficiency on caribou, as Laura talked about so eloquently earlier. Seismic lines are extensive across this landscape. That's one of the amazing things about them, is just how spatially extensive seismic lines can be. They're to some degree persistent through time. They increase predator efficiency. They also have this tendency to fragment wildlife habitat for some species, but they're only one of many different cumulative effects on this landscape, as I hopefully emphasized to you earlier. So the question really before us is that will restoring seismic lines help recover caribou? That is the end game here, right? So if we put our eggs into the seismic restoration basket as heavily as we have been, can we have a reasonable, be reasonably assured that we're going to have some success at recovering caribou over the long term? Why focus on seismic? Well, for reasons that all of us know. The great Sorensen paper in 2008 demonstrated that caribou populations decline as you get increasing levels of cumulative effects of different kinds of disturbance, and recommended that some of these lines are going to have to be substantially restored or reduced. And then there's the work by Melanie Dickey, which showed that, yes, indeed, as people expected, wolves are traveling further and faster on linear features, and that has implications for hunting behavior. So there's very, very good reason for focusing on these linear features. As a landscape ecologist, I find this question incredibly fascinating because there's basically two things that species really need to do on a landscape, and that is find the food and move around to find that food. And in Alberta landscape, you've got this amazing situation where, unlike in other places where resource extraction tends to be an impediment to movement, here resource extraction is actually a facilitator of movement. So you get this hyperlinearization, hypermovement in the landscape, and the effects of that on caribou, I think, are starting to emerge. So if we can reduce that hyperlinearization, that hypermovement, then hopefully that'll help restore some caribou populations. And of course, there's strong regulatory context for this as well. The recovery strategy for woodland caribou delineates that critical habitat should be 65% undisturbed habitat in a range as the minimum disturbance management threshold. This application of a 500-meter buffer to mapped anthropogenic features is recommended, as well as, of course, this coordinated actions to reclaim boreal caribou habitat through restoration efforts. And so there's been a tremendous amount of work in the province of Alberta on seismic restoration projects. I was first made aware of these when I first came on to Alberta Research Council back in the early zeros, working with Brian Coble, and have been involved in it to various degrees since. And Matt Piper was commissioned to put together this report basically listing all the seismic restoration efforts that have occurred in the province of Alberta. And you can see the great work that that Silvacom is currently doing, that Matrix has done, that lots of people have done, both in terms of reclaiming seismic and in trying to understand the effect that reclaiming that seismic has had on the wildlife populations. Our particular area of interest is the Algar study area, and it's interesting because of the nature of the anthropogenic footprint there is perhaps different from some other places. That's the Algar area in that, whatever color that is, sort of sitting in the middle. What is that, like purpley brown? So the Algar Caribou Habitat Restoration Program is a result of a group effort from a bunch of different organizations, formerly OSLI, who have now come together under COSIAGIP. And there are people in this room who know much more about it than I do. I'm just kind of stepping in for Cole here as he moves to UBC and coming to learn more about the program and how it came together. There's a whole bunch of different people who are working here, and the on-the-ground work for restoration has all been done by Silvacom, so hats off to the work that they have done. There's a variety of different treatments that they've implemented here. There's site preparation, tree planting with coarse woody material done on 148 kilometers of line. There's natural regeneration protection on 192. There are research lines, which are no treatment at all, so control lines. And there are additional trapper lines, no treatment. So basically these additional lines are ones that that it was decided that they would be left open because they're being used by trappers or for other purposes, and so they can serve to us as a control site, basically an ad hoc control site, as opposed to a planned control site like the research lines are. So this is a study area right here with the Algar herd outlined in purple, part of the west side Athabasca, or sorry. The Algar landscape is this really neat, unique landscape. It's wetter than you find in a lot of the boreal landscapes, certainly wetter in most of the areas of the boreal that I normally work in. It's quite boggy, there's a lot of lowland, and you don't have a really high degree of footprint intrusion there like you do in some other landscapes. So there's some aerial views here of this marshy, pondy, boggy sort of landscape with some of the intrusion noted there. Mostly what you get in this landscape are these legacy seismic lines as opposed to, say, the Christina Lake, Winifred Lake area that I showed you earlier, where you get the intrusion, a whole pile of other things. So you get these big, long seismic lines tending to be wide, experiencing various levels of natural regeneration or not. Here you can see this is a line that has been treated by mounding. You can actually see the mounds highlighted by the snow in here. There are patches of upland forest in this landscape as well, mostly closer to the river. So the restoration treatments, again, there's folks who can speak to these probably better than I do, but the treatments include mounding, planting, some CWD, in terms of broad strokes, the manipulations that are put on the ground, trying to both impede movement as well as to get the site to regrow quicker. There's natural regeneration, so some of these line segments just started to naturally regrow by themselves, and so it was decided to let those sit as protected and just let nature take its course. And then there's control treatments. These were selected through a very rigorous experimental design that Cole put together, wherein we tried to match and randomly select control segments of lines that match the natural habitat of the treatment lines, and so that we could have a fairly robust ability to ascribe the biodiversity effects that we measure to the treatment versus the control. And this is the real bugaboo in experiments like this, is that we could go in and put cameras on a line and say, well, post-treatment we found X amount of increase or decrease in the presence of these things, but without a really solid treatment control design, you're somewhat limited in your inference ability. So in this study here, as others have done, we've tried really hard to come up with an experimental design that would be very, very robust, and we have a fair bit of confidence in saying those animals are coming back or not using the line because of what we did on that line. And the question is ultimately, will these treatments lead to caribou recovery, right? It's one thing to say that we have met our objectives under the recovery strategy for recovering caribou lines. So in this case, the restoration program came, the restoration calls for 65%, of course, in the recovery strategy. Currently 62% has been restored, and Cole tells me that gap in that 3% is what was left behind for us as control treatments. So there's been a radical increase post-restoration in the area intact. Will this actually now achieve some of our caribou objectives or not, is the goal of this. So in terms of measuring restoration effectiveness, there's two primary questions we're going for. Do these treatments reduce use of line by caribou predators, i.e. do they restore functional caribou habitat? And number two, do these treated areas have a similar mammal community composition as expected under reference conditions? So this satisfies not just the restore functional caribou habitat, but also, I guess, this less tangibly stated demand that we're trying to put the landscape back into something that works the same way as before we were there. If we're successful in keeping wolves off that line, that's great. If we're successful in maintaining caribou populations, that's extra great. If that comes at a cost to the rest of the mammal community, that's a cost we need to be aware of up front so we can manage for it accordingly. So that's one of the things we're trying to get at with this project, which means that we have to monitor multiple species at once. So we proposed a camera trap monitoring program, which Cole implemented through pilot sampling in 2016-17, so this current year. And then he's going to draft some recommendations for full implementation this year for 2017 plus. So we've got target species and hypotheses I think are fairly straightforward, and everyone in this room is aware of them. We want to know if caribou predators are using those treated lines less than the control lines. Right? So we go out and we find wolves on those areas where there's been various kinds of treatment or natural regeneration. We expect that used to be a lot less than on the control lines where we've just kept them open. We expect to see some sort of decline in use over time, right? Recognizing this isn't going to be an overnight thing. If we can track the lag response of predators to that line restoration, what does that look like? And Laura's already talked a lot about some of that and really cool work. So I fully expect that a lot of the work that we're doing, we're going to be consulting with the FRI folks so we can compare notes. Also, some of our target species here are caribou and their competitors, right? So keep in mind there's this apparent competition relationship. If we restore these lines, which would be great, so we prevent wolves from using them quite efficiently, but there's still tons of moose, tons of deer on this landscape bolstering wolf populations. Maybe that might not get us as far as we think. So in addition to understanding what's happening on the lines themselves, we're taking a landscape context approach. What is the mammal community, especially these competitors, looking like in this landscape, and does this change with treatment versus reference conditions and through time? And then, of course, we get data on the rest of the mammal community as well, which is useful for asking some of these biodiversity questions. So the sampling framework is we have line segments as sampling units. So basically pieces of line that were identified first for restoration and then as treatment versus control. So some of these are going to be control. There's no treatment on them at all. It's going to let them go. That's this yellow color. I'm colorblind, so I'm just assuming. I think that's blue. Blue-purple are the treatment lines that have been done. The green are natural regeneration lines, so considered as a treatment, but as opposed to a control, but without any intervention. And then there's human use, which is this ad hoc control, if you will. So we used a random selection of line segments and points for camera deployment along here. So basically each one of these line segments gets a single camera on it, which we run through time. And then we replicate that across the whole landscape. November 2015 was the pilot deployment, and you can see some of the really wet and mucky conditions that Cole et al. Had to contend with in putting these out. Put out pilot cameras on 12 treatment, 12 control. Just 2 weeks ago, went out and checked and redeployed the rest of the camera array. So far, got about 9,000 trap days, 9,000 images, and range of mammal species detected on these things. We got plenty of data on caribou. Found wolves were making extensive use of these lines, black bear, moose, the big bad deer, and then a variety of other things. So, breeding sandhill cranes. There was a lot of those on these sites, which was really interesting, I thought. We got humans and then some smaller prey species as well. So the next steps is analysis of this 2016 data, so the short-term treatment versus control, collect 2017 data, and then Cole's going to run a power analysis to reassess sample size. Are we actually putting enough cameras out there? We chose 60 as an arbitrary number. It's what we had in dry dock. Do we need to actually augment that, and do we need to change our design to be able to be sure that we can detect any effects that might actually exist? And then pool this together with some regional comparisons and synthesis with the work going on in the Rick study area through LIDEA, and also pull in some of the Algar caribou telemetry data through Government Alberta. With that, I'd like to thank, and he has in big bold letters, thank Rochelle Harding at Nexon for all of her hard work, and Robert Albrecht at ConocoPhillips, and then a variety of other people, some of whom are in this room, who have made this work possible so far. So this is an ongoing project over the next few years, so next time you'll have Cole here speaking in person telling you about 2017 results.